Okay. I also have to get used to using something different, and we'll see if I can do it as well as Jesse did. Thank you, Jesse. It was wonderful. Opening up the day with you is just what we needed to hear your story, and I hope that what I will be able to do is put some of that together into there we go, into the philosophy, the theory, the research, and the practical issues of what we have been doing in autism over the last, unfortunately, it's no longer 30 years from when that bio was written, but 40 years. I am the director of the new Autism Center at Hebrew University, have the privilege of working with Dr. Koller, who will talk to you more about the center itself. But I would like to tell you a little bit about what we're doing there. I got to Israel about 40 years ago, and here I'd worked in autism, there I wanted to work in autism, and I'm really actually very happy to say that there are some of the people here that have come today who I know from years that they spent in autism as well, and it is a very exciting thing to know that we have grown as a country and as a community working and devoted to people with autism and their families over the last 40 years. What I am going to do while we're here is actually kind of begin and end my talk with the story of a youngster who I was involved with him since the time he's 3 years old, and today he is 27. And I will try to see little stops along the way so that we can see how things really have developed along with them. It is my honor and my privilege to be here today, and I thank the Hillebrand Foundation for bringing us and allowing us to talk. And I want to say now, as well as at the end, that I, like Jesse, would like very much to be in touch with the people here. Think about it. If you're planning to come to Israel, we can show you what we're doing there, arrange for you to see things and go around with you. And the same thing, we are always ready to learn and grow together. And I think that the idea of having a community of people who is devoted to the idea of what we have to think about when we're thinking about development into adulthood and transitioning into adulthood, we really have to look at research and practice and policy. And that's what I hope to share with you today. So we're going to divide this into two things. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about adults with ASD in autism, with autism spectrum disorder in Israel, and I'll talk a little bit about theory, a little bit about research, and probably a lot more about policy and practice. And then afterwards, Dr. Koller is going to talk about why we felt we needed to have a center, what we hope to achieve with that center, and what we're doing and where we're going. So I will begin with an overview. Oh. So let's do it over there. Okay, I will begin with an overview, and it really will be an overview. We talked very seriously about if we should go into depth and really explain how these services were developed and what we're actually doing, or if I should just give you a brief overview. And we did decide on a brief overview. At the end of this presentation, I have put in links to places where you can find all of the information that you need to find, as well as some reference material for things if you want to go on and read any more. And of course, this will be made available to you. But I really do want to just kind of give you a broad overview and introduce you to the world of services and understanding of ASD in Israel, and share with you now what we're doing and what we really would like to do for our next steps. I will start by saying two things. One is that the adult population somehow has gotten forgotten in the world of research and services. And it's not fair. It isn't a question, once they thought there were only children with autism, but children with autism grow. And it is important for us to remember that it doesn't disappear. And we can listen to the self-advocacy and the points that Jesse made so beautifully this morning and learn from that. And what we've learned is that transition is something that we have to do thoughtfully, mindfully, and with a lot of really hard work to do it. And I really do think that the other thing that we need to talk about is the fact that ASD remains in adulthood the same way as it was in childhood, an incredibly heterogeneous community. And if you know one person, and now we all know one person who is a wonderfully entertaining and accessible adult, really, the only thing that you can say is that you know one adult person with ASD. We have to keep learning and going. There are so many differences between childhood and adulthood in terms of typical development, in terms of people on the spectrum. So what we want to talk about right now are some of those differences, the different expectations, the different needs, and perhaps the different kind of programming that we want to do. As I will start. And I will start with theory and research, and I will try and do this as quickly as I can. We want to deal with the developmental framework. I do believe and hope and pray that we all continue to develop. And that's one of the reasons that you're here. With the help of these kinds of symposia, we learn, we grow, and we develop so that we can do different things and continue to do things in the field and what we're going. And what we need to do is research those things so that we understand evidence-based work, which is based on getting data and understanding where we're going to. So what we're going to try and do is, before we go anywhere with what we're doing here, I am going to just make sure that we're all on the same page, particularly for the people who aren't in this room and who are streaming and going. The changes in the DSM-5 definition of autism, I'm not going through the criteria or anything else, but there were 4 really important points that I think I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page with us. One is that there are no longer 3 or triad of impairments, but there are 2, and the putting together of the impairment in communication and the social impairment into an impairment in social communication and social interaction has really made this the central core part of what we need to look at. And instead of saying, yes, well, you have to have 4 or 3 of the 8 different things in those 2 areas, we now have focused in on what are the core social interactive things. And every person who gets a diagnosis of ASD has to meet those 3 criteria. There are many other things that they will also meet. And autism expresses itself differently in every person, but it is really good to know that we are talking about something which has been more defined and feeds us into what it is that we are looking at. The second is, of course, there has to be the behavioral criteria of restricted and stereotyped behavioral interests. The third point is that now in the DSM-5 definition, the symptoms may not be fully present in early childhood, or even more importantly, something might be there and might be off, but it might have been diagnosed as something different. And there is a place for later diagnosis for people who are particularly bright, or for people who have many other kinds of disabilities and comorbidities in what they go. And we do indeed say that they may not be fully apparent until the social demands are more than the person can deal with at a particular age. So a younger child may be cute, and some of his social disinhibition or inappropriateness in reading social maps can be understood as something a little bit developmentally appropriate. But when that child should be understanding more, or that adolescent should be acting differently, I think it's really important to recognize that the social demands need to exceed the limited capabilities. And the fourth and final thing is something new, and that's a current severity measure that helps us know how much support the person needs, how much servicing that person needs, and it actually helps us understand a little bit more about programming. So if we do that and we say that, what we really need to do is look at, and I'm just putting these on the table now, I am not going to go into each and every one. We want to look and see what it is that we have to do. I just talked about the fact that there probably are different developmental trajectories and different manifestations behaviorally between those people who get diagnosed around the age of 1.5, 2, 3, even maybe 4, and those people who end up getting a diagnosis around 10, 14, or 45. And that happens too. And that later diagnosis can give a sense of legitimacy. I've always known that I was a little bit different, and it can do many other things as well. But it is important to say that it is possible that we as people in the field of autism, families of people with autism, and professionals working with people with autism may end up seeing that there are some differences in the manifestations of ASD according to whether it was an early diagnosis or a later diagnosis. Because for those quite bright people, some of the symptoms may be masked as they go on and do what they want to do. In addition to that, recognize that both at home, where parents incrementally appropriate both their expectations and their home life to whatever it is that goes on with their child, and in school, where there is a clear set of behavioral demands, there is structure. And structure is a good thing. It helps people know what's expected of them and what they can do. And as a result of that, as you leave the structured world of the education framework, if you don't have the structure, all of a sudden, the lack of structure may indeed help deal with the fact that we need different coping mechanisms. And the coping mechanisms that are needed in structured situations are different than those that we need in unstructured situations. And finally, it's really important to recognize that an expectation from an adult is different than an expectation even from an adolescent, but certainly from a child. We're looking at expectations of independence. Parents expect their children at a certain point to be independent of them, perhaps go to university or other educational training programs, certainly be involved in relationships, and be as healthy as possible. And those things are measured in terms of outcome by if a person is gainfully employed, where they're living, and what are their leisure time activities. On purpose, I didn't say relationships here. I will not be talking about it. It is important for me to mention Marcia Malik-Seltzer's work from University of Wisconsin at Madison. She has been following people on the spectrum from childhood into adolescence and adulthood, and really has come out with a lot of research-based information about that deals with all of these issues. I am a developmental psychologist. I work with development. I hope I am always learning and growing, and I really want to say that everything that I'm going to present today reflects a developmental perspective in clinical work, in research, and the idea that what we're not looking for is just a state of the art at a particular point in time, but we want to know how people grow and learn. And if I had more time, I would tell you a couple of wonderful stories, but the bottom line of one is that as her 63-year-old son said something for the first time to a mother, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "You see, if he would live to be 200 years old, he'd be normal." In addition to development and growth and everything that we need, we really do want to recognize that today we live in the 21st century, and we believe in, I hope, I certainly do, the fact that research can inform what it is that we are doing. I am a researcher, and as a result of that, everything that I do needs to be measurable, needs to be checkable, and should be replicable. Now, there is not just a science to our work. There is also an art. And if we put development together with science, what I think we can end up getting is what we call evidence-based practice. It is the art of working with people. It is the idea of taking into account our professional expertise, our understanding, also looking to get research, but look at what the needs are and where people are. If we do that together and we work forward, I'm going to destroy this. Okay. And we work forward up the thing from looking at services and studies that look into services, we should be able to ask the right questions, research them, and develop practice that we should all be able to do. Moving forward, again, just as an overview. That's the reason I keep putting that word there, because I'm trying to put out the basis and hopefully finish quite quickly for the services that we have and the research that we're doing in Israel right now among adults. So the principles that are underlying service provision for adults are basically the same ones that we see as we develop services for any individual that has ASD. But it has a little bit of a different twist for it, okay? I can't talk about each of them, but I am basically going to say, and I think we heard this very, very nicely from the examples that Jesse gave of things that he needed to do. We do need to talk about mutual accommodation. We do need to talk about the fact that if there could be a room where someone can go to flap so that they wouldn't be doing it in front of the people that will not understand why that flapping is so important and so acceptable, that would be a very good thing. As adults, unfortunately, for all of us here, people accommodate us less, and it's thought that we're supposed to accommodate them more. But I think that if we remember the idea of mutual accommodation, particularly into more independent and less structured kinds of formats, I think we'll do a very good job. Remembering, of course, that everything needs to be individualized. We need to look at the specific person who is in front of us and see what we can do. Which means, by the way, that there needs to be a lot of services and not just one. And it means that there needs to be some kind of spectrum and continuum of services so that I can take the individual and say this would be appropriate for him as opposed to something else. There should be structure, the right amount of structure for that individual. All work continues to begin with an assessment of strengths and weaknesses, pitfalls that might happen, looking through that assessment to make the individualized program with the amount of structure and accommodate the person we're talking about. That may only work if we have partnerships. If we build partnerships with service agencies around the country on different levels. Service agencies, parents. I know that we're talking about adults, but you know what? It's really important to help those parents who did everything that they could with their children when they were young and really feel like they still need to be involved because nobody loves their child the way a parent does. And I think we need to have partnerships, not just among agencies, not just with parents, but also among ourselves. We all bring different things to the table. And if we can be working together interdisciplinarily, which is what I think that we'll talk about in terms of our center, I think we'll all see that everyone benefits from that. What we need to do as we're talking about adults is get out into the community, because without community involvement, we can't do the kinds of things that we want to do. And I repeat again, and I need to say that, we are talking about getting data, following what we're doing, and making sure that we have the empirical approach. So this is really where I want to go here. We are going to talk about the kinds of transitioning into young adulthood that we have in Israel. I'm going to talk to you about what kinds of programming we have, and a little bit of some research that we've done in that. And from there, I'd really like to share with you some of our thoughts for the future. So what we're going to do now is go into a program which is called Avnei Derech L'Chaim, which is Life Milestones. Life Milestones is an outgrowth of work of different professionals and families and social agencies when they finally woke up and realized that school-age children do not do as well in the adult world as some people would have expected. And there are lots of pitfalls, and unfortunately, not everyone has the option of volunteering to learn. And more importantly, perhaps, what ends up happening, unlike some of the stories that Jesse told us, for some of them, it really is a dead end, because once they're fired from one place of employment, they won't look for another one, because that's really hard. So what we wanted to do was recognize the fact that there is a need for transitional programming, and that perhaps what we knew from moving from elementary school to middle school to high school, we do so well. But guys, that's moving from school to school to school. When that school's not there, we've got the school of real life. And that is not the same as educational frameworks. So this is a program that was set up, and it has government accreditation for young adults between the ages of 17 to 25, whose mission is to assist young adults with ASD to achieve maximum independence for each one individually. In other words, there isn't a goal that they have that everyone will be living in the community or that everyone will go to university, but rather it is an individualized program for maximum independence. And the collaboration is in essence not just in the practical clinical guide, but actually in setting up new programs. And they've done such a wonderful job. What they do basically is all of their programming is done in the communities. They're in Jewish community centers. They're in programs that exist in leisure places. And what they want to do is support people who decide to go on for education. What they want to do is look into employment options for wherever they're going to go, along with the social services who are supposed to be providing those kinds of things. All of it is individualized, but it is based on the fact that one of the things that differentiates adults and children is an adult should be making more choices and their own choices, even if they're not the choices their families will necessarily agree with. A quick story. We'll call this person, I called my other one Yossi, I'll call this one Moshe. Okay? Moshe's family got in touch with me when Moshe was about 12, and he told them that he did not want to have a bar mitzvah. And this is a very religious and devout family with 12 kids, and he was their oldest, and they were really scared that if he didn't do something that would really be a problem for their family. And they came and we got together, and he had a bar mitzvah. And then I didn't hear anything from them again until he was 16, when they called me up and they said, I don't know what to do. He listens to Oriental music on the Jerusalem Pirate channel on the radio at really loudly, and anyone who walks by our house is going to think that we're no longer religious, and this can't happen. So we figured out how to do what I did not say he shouldn't be listening to that music, because he liked that music. But we figured out how we could deal with that until they came back again at age 18 and said, he wants to be a bus driver. We don't have bus drivers in our family. Now, I gotta say, one of his concerns was that he knew every single bus schedule in the entire country, not just in Jerusalem. And it was really a cool thing because he could solve problems. Like when this line was running backwards, he could say, oh, the person only has to take these 2 lines and he would still get there. And this was before Waze, and this was before GPS. He's now 32. And in the end analysis, we had time. He went on to yeshiva. He went on to this. He went on to that. And today he works for the Egged Bus Consortium in a room. When there is a problem, the drivers call him. And he sits there with his mings and he solves the problems. And the parents are no longer embarrassed because they were afraid he was going to be the bus driver bringing their friends home to their neighborhood. And they couldn't handle that. But it got solved because we made choices. And I think it's really important to do that. So if we continue on just our overview, are you keeping time for me? You're good. Thank you. Okay, if we do that, let's go on and think about, which I didn't do in all of my stories with these wonderful people, is how can we support people while they're making those tough choices, while they're moving forward? Well, the way that we can do it is also through Avnei Derech L'Chaim. What we can do here is say, okay, there are basically 3 levels of things that we can think about. The first one is that we can think about coaching or tutoring or mentoring. We have a woman at Hebrew University who's doing her doctorate, who is lovely and just came to talk to professionals, as Jessie did, as a self-advocate. Unfortunately, in our world, it's a little bit more difficult to do that. And she is very, very, very scared about coming out with these things. So she did come with big sunglasses and a wig. And as the person who's known her the longest in the room, she walked right past me and I didn't recognize her. So it was really quite scary to me that she still felt that she needed to support herself that way. But she was having terrible time with time management and time organization, as, by the way, many of us do as well. But we connected her with a professional who works in a high school and talked to that professional and said, you know, she really needs you to coach her. Could you do that? And that has been one of the most productive relationships that has come out of this. And that is happening through Avnei Derech L'Chaim. In addition, there needs to be a lot of discussion. Jesse said it in his talk this morning when he said, you know, if there's a problem, talk about it. Why is it that it's such a difficulty? Identify what is difficult. Try to negotiate. Okay, so you have 3 things that you have to put in for your doctorate right now. Let's make a different time schedule for that. You can negotiate and see what you can do, and any other kind of appropriate aids. It is wonderful when people have an organization behind them and they don't feel that they have to do it themselves. Transitional activities via Avnei Derech L'Chaim include group meetings where they talk about identity. What kinds of things are happening to you where you're working, where you're studying, in your home with your parents? Stalking has become one of the topics that come up in these group meetings. They also have individual meetings, particularly for the people who get a diagnosis later and who don't necessarily or are not necessarily identified with the ASD community as such. So they have those meetings. They do what they want. They do have preparatory courses where they actually teach skills. They're most, the one that's most in demand is the one that they have for independent living. There's an apartment, they go in, they learn how to do different things in the apartment, and it works out very nicely. They have preparatory courses for the Army that are not under the Army's jurisdiction. It's very interesting. A lot of kids today at 18 decide that they want to take a year off between high school and the Army, and what they do is a preparatory course that is supposed to help them be stronger when they actually go into the Army. Sometimes it's for religious kids and they want to strengthen themselves religiously. It's for secular kids who want to understand more about why we have to have an army and what's going on in the geopolitical system. And sometimes it's actually just a social group that then go into the Army together, so you have social support for that. By the way, there are now those kinds of preparatory courses through the Army for kids with ASD. And maybe more importantly, they are also integrated in some of the ones that exist today. So this one, I went off on a little tangent. This one is run through Avnei Derech, not connected to the Army. In addition, they have people who will go into universities and help them, and they have a developmental center along with Social Security support where they actually have a preparation for employment, which is quite nice. In addition, the three things that need to be mentioned are that Avnei Derech works with other agencies, with other groups, through the university, through the Army, and through Social Security. There is a lot of parental involvement, not necessarily specifically with their own children, but in the idea of what other services need to be developed and where are we going. And it has been accredited through the government. I don't expect anybody to read these things, but the thing in the middle there, in terms of support, is a poster which is telling about one of the groups that I talked about, and it's really called For You and For Your Growth. And it is really a question of, we've got an answer for you to any question that you can ask. What has happened is that sometimes we don't know what questions they are going to ask. In addition, there's other programs that are recognized, each one doing what they can. So here is really the basis of what it is that we were kind of asked to talk about, and that is what kind of programming is really happening in Israel today. And there are some amazingly exciting, wonderful things. We still have a long way to go. And there is much more that needs to happen. But it was exciting for me to organize this information for you, to share the exciting things that, thank goodness, are happening now. So with the completion of high school, which may be at age 17, because some of our people are incredibly bright, but also it could be at the age of 18 and could be at the age of 21, because special education in the state of Israel is from 3 till 21. And some of these kids take those extra 3 years to do a full matriculation exam, which they couldn't do if they had to do the exam in so much close environment. And as a result of that, when they complete their high school, they either move on to some kind of employment, or, as most of the youngsters do in Israel, they go on to some kind of service, either national service or the army service, or they can go into higher education, or they can start at the army and then go on to education. They can be employed for a while and only then go on to the army. There's lots of different ways to do it. I will note that what does not appear on this flow chart is residential living. That can happen at any point, and it is not something that I'm going to specifically talk about now, though there are lots of options, and as a result of that, indeed, I can tell you who to talk to and what to talk to if you're at all interested in that. But what I am going to share with you is a little bit of how the army in Israel is a social institution, as much as a security institution. And I know that from working here in the States as a diagnostician, typically when I diagnosed young children here in America, when people went away with a diagnosis, sometimes the parents asked, so will he ever get married? In Israel, more than 80% of the parents who receive a diagnosis of ASD, their first question is, will he serve in the army? Because it is a milestone. It's something that is a social, it's less than it was. It was once that everybody did it, and now there's people who don't do it. But if you don't serve in the army, you usually do volunteer for some kind of national service. And it's something that's important to the parents. It's something that goes on with that. So it was important for us to start thinking about what that meant for the parents, for the kids, for the army, and for the country in terms of taking people on. So when we talk about the army, we talk about one of two separate possibilities in terms of getting into the army. One is that they can enlist. The second one is that they can volunteer. You do realize that there is a third option, and that's called nothing. Okay, so if that goes on, then we have, if you're going to enlist, you have to meet criteria. And there are different criteria, but if you're going to enlist, you can enlist in one of two tracks. You can enlist in the regular enlistment track of the Army, or you can be a soldier who has enlisted in the Army, but in a supported program. You can volunteer in the Army, and here's the trick. You have to be accepted to volunteer in the Army. Not everybody who wants to volunteer in the Army can. So if you're accepted to volunteer in the Army, you can do a volunteer in the Army, or you can volunteer in national service. My little Yossi, who I told you about at the beginning, I'm going to tell you about what he decided to do and why. Oops. Okay, I'll try again. I can't do it. Can you? Thank you. All right. So I was involved 10 years ago in working with the Army in the tract of having a supported system for enlisting people in the Army who had a diagnosis of ASD. So when people go into the Army, they get a profile number. The profile number can be 96, which means that they're going to go be combat soldiers. Is that what it's called? I don't know all this terminology in English, but I'll do my best. You need a certain profile in order to be combat soldiers. The second that a person goes to the Army and says, I have a diagnosis of ASD, I finished my full matriculation exam, I'm very competent, I want to serve in the Army, they can be evaluated to see if they are able to serve in the Army, but they will never have a profile that's higher than 45. 45 means you cannot be a combat soldier. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. Okay, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And so what we did was we took a small group of people who were 18 years old, all of whom had completed a matriculation exam, and as a result of that, were able to be enlisted with a profile of 45 into the Army. In order to be involved in this particular program, we decided to make a threshold of the fact that they could complete regular basic training. A horrible thing, basic training, but it does pull the group together. It does see how you react under pressure, how you read different kinds of signals. And there are people who go through basic training who have more issues than our kids with a diagnosis of ASD. So it can be done. And then what we did was we chose 6 different units in the Army that we felt would give options to the very wide spectrum of interests of our kids, and that we could perhaps help those units understand a little bit more about ASD and what would be helpful to have, what would be good about having soldiers with ASD in their units. The only people who knew about a diagnosis of these soldiers was the mental health officer, and every unit has a mental health officer, and the officers of the particular unit that this person was in. We did try to cover everything. We have computer stuff because a lot of our kids are good on computers, but not everybody. And it's not right for everybody. So we have the computers. We have the Army magazine because, like Jesse, we have a couple of these kids who are really good at writing. Sometimes, unlike Jesse, better at writing than they are at talking because they can put it down and think about it and deal with it that way. We did have an Into the Intelligence unit. There is a dog unit that goes out and checks to see if something is going to blow up or not. And they have people who train the dogs, and we thought that might be really good for some of our people. We had 2 of our people who one of their areas of interest was really sports and exercise, so we did that, and sometimes in the education corps. It really worked nicely. We, over the next 3 years, had 3 cohorts. Those cohorts were in the Army for a total of 9 years, 3 years for each of them. And at this point, unless they're not sure about if they should accept somebody or not, because the first 3 years I went through all of the records of all the people who were there, but I don't have anything to do with it. except when parents find out that I did it, and then I get a phone call and say, could you get him in there, please? But besides that, the Army has taken full responsibility for this program, which is just as it should be, because then it's theirs. And the second that they take that responsibility, it means it's going to work. So if we do that, let's try again. If we do that, that is actually going in to the community of enlisted soldiers. There's another option, and that is volunteering. Volunteering is here too. You need to have meet their prerequisites. You have to have an exam, and in this particular unit, you need to be accepted to a preparatory course and pass the course. And if you don't pass the course, then you don't end up being in it. The unit is called Looking Forward, or Ro'im Rachok, for someone who would prefer to hear how that sounds. And they started with basically deciphering aerial photographs. And from that, it's gone much farther. They have 5 options of different things that they can do. It's all in the same unit in the Army. They can decipher aerial photographs. They can gather information, and boy, are they good at finding things that we would never find. They can work in quality control, which actually is one of the areas that Jesse was talking about this morning. They have optic and electronics technicians, because there are a lot of hardware in the Army of the things that they're doing. And they just added this year railway testers. I don't know what they're testing, but they're testing something. I'm actually not going to continue to talk about this program for a second, except to tell you 2 things. One is the BBC did a 20-minute documentary on it, and the link is on the program. You can look, and I'm going to show you now 2 minutes of that film. And secondly, to tell you that on every Israel Independence Day, according to the number of years that Israel has been in existence, we have people lighting flames for different accomplishments that have happened. And last year, the young man whose picture I chose for you to see from the BBB, I edited a little piece for you to see. He lit one of those flames for Independence Day, and we all cried. And there you go. Could you put that on for us, please?
The idea of the program is to give young adults on the autistic spectrum the opportunity to use their strength to the needs of the security community. And the idea was to use the visual capabilities. We started with aerial photo analyst, and then we looked for other skills.
People on the spectrum are very good doing what you need to analyze, which is you need a great capability of concentration, and that's something they have. They find changes and differences very fast, faster than a normal person.
I am one of the better people at my specific jobs. I like the sense of knowing that I can make my mark. Being a soldier is purpose, is life, is order. I feel good here. And now I'm slowly understanding how it is to be a part of, well, any functioning company that exists today in the workforce.
We were talking about new life model for people with autism. For some of them, it's the first time they have real friends. It's very rewarding to see the pride of the families. The child is making them happy, and they're proud in what he's doing. And it's not only the challenge that they have, but they can see that he's part of something important and he's achieving.
החוויה שנתנה לי עזרה קצת, כאילו באופן חברתי דברים כאלו, אבל נתן לי קצת ניסיון, כאילו.
ברגע שסביבה מתייחסת לזה כשווים, אז זה הופך למשהו אחר לגמרי. וגם התוכנית הזאת בעצם באה בדיוק מאותו מקום, לתת לאנשים להתקדם כמו אנשים רגילים, לא משהו מיוחד.
Okay. I really just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste. It's worthwhile watching the entire thing for sure. But we'll try again. Might be the reason it's not working. Just a sec. Okay. But indeed, the idea of using strengths and not weaknesses and the idea that parents have something to be proud of was really central. This program was set up by people in the Army, and they have totally taken it over with a great deal of pride. And Dan, who is the youngster who was talking with his parents, was indeed the youngster who lit the flame in on Israel Independence Day. So the other option is the ability to do national service. And if you're going to do national service, you also have to be accepted to national service. And national service, in order to be accepted into national service, you can do it in one of three ways. It has to be done through an organization because the organization actually takes responsibility. And Shalhevet is a program that was set up specifically for our youngsters going into service. Ben Ami is an organization that does it for religious girls, does it for people who want to be involved in national service and not in Army service. And there is another program called the Gvanim, which means variation, or I call it diversity, which also does Arab young people who want to go into the Army but don't feel comfortable enlisting. All Arab citizens of Israel get a call up to serve in the Army as well. If they choose to volunteer instead of serving as an enlisted soldier, they can do it through one of these things as well. As a result of that, many, many more of our young adults are going into the Army, are having that kind of experience, and then going on either to employment or to universities. In the universities, we also have two different ways of going into it. You can either go in to a specialized program, which was set up for people with a diagnosis of ASD. The two most well-known ones are one that is at Ariel University, where they take a group of people with diagnosis. They also have to be done, but they are not in they're in a certification program as opposed to in an academic program. And there's another one at Tel Aviv University where they take people who are a little bit lower functioning and they put them into a preparatory program, get them around the university, and they have to then go through the system proving that they can indeed do something at the university. That's one option. And the second option is basically going into one of the existing universities, the Technion, Haifa University, or, for example, at our university. It is really true that what we have are many, many different programs, and the programs that we have are programs which right now are being advertised as something special for this population. On the right, we have a program that deals with adults on the spectrum, and they have partnered with the Open University in Israel. Open University is just what it sounds like. People study by themselves. They can meet once a week as a group around a subject, but you can get a BA basically independently or externally is the way that they say it in Israel. And by partnering some expertise in the area of ASD with the flexibility of an external degree program, we have many of our people who are finishing degrees and then have a degree for which they can go out into the employment world. And there are the program at Tel Aviv, which I described a little bit. There's also a college called Tiltan, and Tiltan is a program which specializes in design, in fabric design, in graphic design, again, using some really good visual abilities. So there's lots of things that are going on, and we are trying to keep abreast of what's going on by looking at some of what goes on. I really do have to tell you that I'm going to show you now 3 different studies, and really quickly, I'm not going to bore you with how many people were in it and what methodologies we did, but I'm going to try and give you a bottom line. We took a group of people who were studying in higher education facilities, and we looked at their social competence, we looked at their use of social support and affiliatory activity in the university, and we looked at their reported feelings of loneliness. If you look at the graph, the blue are those who did not do service, either volunteering or Army service, and those in the red did do Army service. And it's quite amazing how, again, being very cautious in interpreting these results, it's very clear that those who did the Army had better social competence skills. They were more capable of using the support systems within the university, and they reported less loneliness. This is not causality. This is correlational, okay? The second thing that we've looked at is quality of life. Quality of life is a wonderfully amorphic kind of concept which says, how happy are you? How much satisfaction do you have? What's your general well-being? And it can be measured by many different things. In general, adults with ASD report a lower quality of life than anybody else. Other people with developmental disabilities, neurotypical people, regardless of their age. And yet, it is a very nice measure. So we asked ourselves, I did this with a student, he just presented it at a conference, but we asked what influences the quality of life of individuals with ASD, and what is it dependent on? So here's your question. Employment? Financial compensation? I know if I get paid more for something, I typically like it better. Maybe people who had better leisure time activities, who could do different things like that? Or how about their level of independence and feeling good about themselves with doing things? Very surprisingly, the result that we found among 36 young adults and adults up to the age of 38 was that the degree of satisfaction with their living arrangements was the thing that had the most correlation with their quality of life. If I get home and I feel good about my home, I feel good about most of the other things that I'm doing. Okay, last one. Tell me, what is predictive of successful employment? Is it how smart you are if you have ASD? Is it how severe your symptoms are? Perhaps it's how good you can communicate with your other fellow workers. Well, once again, it wasn't any of those things. Surprisingly enough, the people who worked the most, had the most thought that they would have a job at all, worked the most number of hours, and needed the fewest supports were those who were best at taking care of themselves in daily living skills. Get those kids more independent, and they will be able to be independent. So in sum, we didn't talk about intimate relationships, or really we didn't really talk about living arrangements and options. But it is really clear that if we do good assessments and we have other options, we can look for appropriate intervention as long as we do some transition planning with supports in place, and they can do Army service, and they can go to university, and they can be employed. So if we do that, I'm actually not going to show you my little Yossi because I forgot to tell you all about him, but I'm going to have time to give you at the end. He's in that movie. I do want to tell you about some of our directions for the future, which will lead us into Judah talking about our wonderful new center that we have that we want to go on. Before I get to the directions for the future, I am going to take a minute and talk to you about my little Yossi. I was in the States at my first sabbatical, and I was there in working here, and this is an Israeli couple who knew me from Israel, and this is their firstborn child, and he was 3 years old, and the father was doing a specialization in childhood something, and I'm not going to tell you what, in case you might know someone who did that, at Boston Children's Hospital, and little Yossi was diagnosed with autism at age 3 at Children's Hospital in Boston. And the parents called me hysterical. Should we stop the specialization and go back to Israel? What about an Israeli couple? What about 2 languages? Are we making it more difficult for him with speech? Should we stay in America and not go back to Israel? What does this mean for us? And we spent a lot of time talking about it. They stayed for the specialization. When Yossi was 6 years old, they came back to Israel. He went through the entire specialized programs that we have. He did volunteer in the Army instead of going into one of these things. He has a great deal of anxiety, and he just did not want to be anywhere near guns. And he ended up, through connections that his parents had, working in the Ministry of the Foreign Ministry. The Foreign Ministry, doing really lots of things with translating papers and organizing papers and doing that. And last September, he got married. And that brings me to our close, where basically my message is that there's lots for us to do and there's lots more to do. But what we should do is find that research should address real issues that we want to deal with, but real issues should also be researched. Let's ask the questions, make our hypotheses, gather data, analyze that data so that we can draw conclusions and we can continue to grow. And what we would like to do is grow through our Autism Center. Thank you very much.
So I realized as Cory was wrapping up that not only do I have the second half of a back-to-back lecture, but I'm also right now between you and lunch. So I guess I'm wishing myself luck. Okay, I want to first echo some of what Cory opened with and thank Meredith and Beth at the UJA for the organization and the Hillebrand family for the existence of this program. And I want to say specifically that although I met Debbie last year for the first time, I actually knew her name and the family name because I did my postdoc at the Yale Child Study Center, where they're also involved and support. And that's actually, it's somewhat unique because it means that the Hillebrand family actively supports both science and research and programs in academia, and also community programs like the one that we're at today. And that's very much in sync with my own perspective and my own experience. And so I want to express my deep respect and appreciation for that fact. I also want to say that it's particularly fun for me to be here today. I grew up in Brooklyn, moved to Israel when I was 18, but then came back for my doctorate at Yeshiva University at Furkauf up in the Bronx, and then did my postdoc at Yale in New Haven. So I very much feel like I have come home, and the UJA is an institution that I very much grew up hearing about and knowing of, and so it's a treat to be here today. Clicker. I'm going to use what Cory told you as a stepping stone to speak about the work that we are doing at the Autism Center of Hebrew University to fill the gaps and advance the field in terms of adults with autism, both in clinical services and also in terms of research. It's important for me to say that even in our mission statement, all the work that we do, although we are an academic center and we sit at Hebrew University, the work that we do is mandated to be in the service of individuals and families affected by autism. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce you to the center, tell you a bit about who we are, what we do, and put us in context for you. So the center was officially established in August 2015, so we're still in our infancy and early childhood. The center stands upon 4 pillars. The first is that of research, both in terms of the research that we do, but also, as Cory mentioned, the belief that all work that is done should be evidence-based and should always be questioned in terms of its efficacy. Is this working? Why is this working? If it's not working, why is it not working? The second pillar is that of clinical services, which I would say is not standard for many academic centers. And so I'll come back to that and speak a little bit more about what we're doing in that field in a couple of minutes. The third pillar is that of training. And so we are working to train both students within the university who are coming up in relevant fields, but also professionals who are already in the field working in support of individuals and families with autism to provide them with the necessary training and support to do the work. Oh, the T is not where it's supposed to be. That's unfortunate. Things one only notices after they send the slides. But the fourth pillar, which is no less important, is that of community engagement. And what this speaks to is basically our belief, like Jesse said, and I very much appreciated both your entire lecture, but also this point specifically, this idea of nothing about us without us. We do not believe that we, in the halls of the university in the ivory tower, are in a position to dictate what is right and what is good. We believe that we are in a position to work in collaboration and cooperation with individuals with autism and families affected with autism to create appropriate supports and programming. And so we have a mandate for every committee that exists within our center, from the academic advisory committee all the way down. There must always be either an individual with autism or a family member of an individual with autism on the committee. Today, we are going to focus specifically on the first 2 pillars, so those of research and clinical services. Say that our approach and our perspective when looking at all of this work is inter and multidisciplinary. I should say not just multidisciplinary. The idea is not just that there are people from different fields, but it's interdisciplinary. So the idea is that we are eventually all going to be sitting under one roof looking at the same question, the same challenges, but from multiple disciplines, multiple perspectives, but all in conversation, in dialogue with each other. We also very much recognize that we can't do the work that we want to do alone. And so from the time that Cory and I worked to conceptualize the center even, we knew that we would need important and strategic partners in the community. And so we are working in close collaboration and cooperation with Hadassah Medical Center, which is also Hebrew University Medical Center. And I'll give one example of that collaboration in a bit. We're working together with the Israeli Ministries of Health, Education, and Welfare, with the relevant parent and family organizations in the community, NGOs, like Alut and Shekel, which are major players in this field in Israel. Obviously hand in hand with the professional community, with individuals who are already in schools, in clinics, in residential settings in the community doing this work. And as I said, most importantly, together with individuals and families with autism. So in the 21st century, we work to establish the center. And what do you actually need to do in order to exist in the 21st century? You need a website and you need an email account. And as soon as you have that, you say, look, we're here. We've established ourselves. And so we have a website. I'll put the link up at the end. But we created an email account. You'll have that also on the last slide. But something happened when we created the email account. We started getting all types of emails and inquiries from the community. And after a while, it became clear that certainly within some of the emails, there was a theme. So, dear Autism Center, I am an adult with autism. What services can you provide? To whom it may concern, I have an adult son with autism. Is there something that you can do to help us? One of the emails up here says 2 years ago, my son, the soldier, and my husband for 24 years were both diagnosed simultaneously with autism. Again, reaching out in search of support, in search of guidance, and in search of programming. I want to zoom in to one of these emails to kind of clarify. So I'm going to translate, obviously. This email says, you're welcome. This email says, Dear Autism Center, my name is, I was diagnosed at the age of 36 as an ASPE, in parentheses, high functioning, despite the fact that I am currently single, unemployed, and unable to hold down a job for more than a few months at a time. I am a member of an unnamed group, which is the only official group that provides services to Aspies diagnosed in adulthood, and there I'm on a waiting list for individual therapy. I wanted to know what services you provide to adult Aspies and how I can be helped by you to live a better life. Now, this is not the only email of this kind that we received, but it certainly makes the point. The fact that we are a new center, we have not been around for 20, 30 years, and people are reaching out to us and saying, how can you help me live a better life, means that despite the wonderful programming and services that you just heard about, we have a ways to go. There are many gaps in the system, many holes that need to be filled. And so we set about a process of thinking about, first of all, what are these holes, and then how can we do our part to try to fill these gaps. And so when we began thinking about the clinical services that we would be providing together with our partners, we did a kind of mapping of the public system, primarily in the Jerusalem area, which is where we are. And we thought about what we could do that is not really being adequately done. We recently opened, I'm very excited to say it took a while, but we did recently open a diagnostic clinic for school-aged children up through the age of 21. This is taking place at Hadassah Medical Center. The diagnostic services in the community until the age of 6, 7, 8 are actually fairly good in Israel. But after that, like many places in the United States and around the world also, there's a bit of a cliff that you begin to fall off. And obviously when you reach adulthood, that cliff is even steeper. But we've succeeded in opening up a clinic for school-age children. Until this year, there was no evidence-based parent training program for parents of children with autism provided in Israel. So I'm proud to say that we are already running a number of groups for parent training, both in Hebrew and in Arabic. We're doing a pilot now, and we hope to expand those services next year. A population that often does not receive the attention or support that they need in this world is actually that of grandparents, who are often very supportive, very involved, and receive very little in terms of formal support and programs from the community. And so together actually with a professor who's at the university who does not work in the field of autism, but happens to be the grandfather of a child with autism, we will be starting a group for grandparents. In June, we'll be having our second annual Family Education Day. And we recently had our first annual Professional Education Day, which Cory mentioned. And these are days which reflect our belief that if there is knowledge that we have in the halls of academia, knowledge that, if we're being honest, has been gained based on the clinical population, which are individuals with autism and their families who have agreed to participate in studies, so has been gained basically on the backs of these families or by the grace of these families, it is our responsibility to find a way to build bridges to give that information and that knowledge back to them. And so these days are specifically designed to welcome in both professionals and families separately by design, to provide them with kind of a snapshot of what we know in this field. But perhaps the biggest hole in the puzzle, as we were mapping this field, was service for adults with autism. And so I'm very happy to say that we are in discussions right now with the Israeli Ministry of Health in collaboration with the Jerusalem Center for Mental Health to establish the first, and I'm not happy that it's the first, but I'm at least happy that we're finally there, clinic for adults with autism in the Jerusalem area. This is a clinic that will hopefully be open by the next academic year. We will be providing, again, interdisciplinary assessment. We'll be starting actually for individuals who have not received a diagnosis of autism. So not individuals who received one earlier on and are looking for a confirmatory diagnosis for one reason or another, but there is a whole group of adults who were not diagnosed for various reasons. We talk about diagnostic overshadowing, right? Many years ago, they may have been diagnosed with something else, other mental health issues, intellectual disability, but now we understand much more how to tease these apart or how to recognize that it might be intellectual disability and autism, but our ability to understand the diagnostic presentation today is far advanced from what it was years ago. And so we'll be beginning specifically with these challenging cases. We hope to rapidly transition from providing diagnostic services to providing support services. Some examples would include social skills groups for adults with autism, support groups for adults with autism, and vocational training programs as a stepping stone to employment. I'll translate this also. This is actually something that's not affiliated with our center, but is certainly affiliated with the Hebrew University. There was an announcement sent out a couple of months ago, I believe, about a student-led group for students at Hebrew University. The way they say it is students who feel that they belong to the autism spectrum. And so there's a student group on Hebrew University's Maths and Sciences campus at Givat Ram, which is meant to provide a framework, social support, specifically they say help dealing with the bureaucracy and things that are involved in going to university that maybe individuals on the spectrum might have a challenge with. And so we are very happy that this exists. I know Cory will be speaking at one of their early meetings, and we very much look forward to working in collaboration with this group. I'm going to transition now to the research part of my talk. But what I want to highlight as I do that is that our belief is that this bifurcation, this split between what we would call the academic community and what I might call the actual community or the real community is an artificial bifurcation. It's a split that should not exist. And so the work that we are doing, while I will now be talking about some research that's happening at our center, it is not our belief that these are two distinct conversations. It is our belief that all of these four pillars support the same house, and that there needs to be dialogue and back and forth interaction and communication that is mutually enriching between all of these different pillars. And so we very much work in a way where the research should be informing the work that's happening in the community, and vice versa. What's happening in the community and the individuals in the community from various groups should be informing what's happening in terms of research. So I have now what is a relatively uncommon and perhaps challenging honor, and that is presenting other people's research. My personal research actually doesn't focus on adults with autism, but we're working at the university faculty member or post-sec groups. So if Moshe went to the army, that doesn't necessarily make him more likely to have a job. Or if Daphne had a job, that doesn't necessarily mean that she was more likely to have gone to university or received any education post-high school. This is a little bit counterintuitive. What these findings indicate is actually kind of a refuting of what's called the normalization thesis in disability research. So this normalization thesis says that once an individual with a disability overcomes one typical milestone, we should expect them to be more likely to overcome subsequent milestones. But it seems, at least based on this data, based on this study, that's not necessarily the case. So I actually framed it negatively, but it could be framed positively as well. The fact that somebody didn't serve in the army does not mean that they are less likely to have a job or gain employment or go to university. This strengthens a saying that has already, I'm actually happy that it has come up already today, because this is possibly the most, I want to say overused, but still incredibly accurate statement in the autism community. And that is that if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. But perhaps these findings also beg an addendum to this statement. And perhaps that is that if you know one thing about one person with autism, you know one thing about one person with autism. And because we know they may have strengths or challenges in a certain arena, we should not take that and then assume that they will have strengths or challenges in another arena. Individuals in general are not that simple, and certainly we know that individuals with autism are not that simple. So we should not see a challenge in one area and assume that there's a certain direction we should encourage them to go in. It is our responsibility, of course, as a society, to find their areas of strength and guide them to an appropriate place. Michael also found that employment opportunities for adults with autism increased their earning power. Apparently, there's a theory in economics called human capital theory, which states that this should be the case. But I would argue that this is not something to take for granted in this situation. Because this means that once an individual with autism gets a job, their earning power automatically increases. What that actually means, when we translate it into reality, is that they are not necessarily staying at entry level positions in the job market. And that when an individual with autism gets a job, we can expect and hope that they too would climb the hierarchy and receive promotions. It's important to state that even with this statement, the earning power for individuals with autism is still significantly lower than typically developing peers, even in comparable fields and professions. So there is something encouraging here, but also clearly work to be done. In terms of our practical takeaway from Michael's study, I would say that this tells us that we need policy and practice to support adults who either are transitioning into the workforce or, significantly, the adults who should be transitioning into the workforce but are not for various reasons. And we need to not only support these individuals but also their employers. We need to provide them with the necessary orientation and training and guidance and ongoing support. We should not expect, although we might want to believe, yes, everybody should employ adults with autism. Life is obviously not that simple, and we need to take it upon ourselves to create programming that provides ongoing support to allow this to happen. Solomon Israel is a brilliant faculty member at the university who has a fascinating story. He was actually born in Iran, grew up in California, where he did his undergrad at UCLA, came to Hebrew University for graduate school, finished his doctorate, back to the States, did his postdoc at Duke, and in 2014 came back and joined the faculty of the university. And he researches, among other things, genetics and hormones related to autism. And Solomon asks a question. He says, why is it that some individuals seek social engagement, we go after it, we look for it, while others shy away? We prefer not to engage in social interactions. And he offers one potential answer. He says, perhaps this is moderated by individual differences in the levels of oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that is released by the pituitary gland. It is related to contractions during birth. It allows moms to breastfeed. It's colloquially known as the love hormone because of its association with infant-mother bonding. And there's a bunch of research actually that's been done relating to oxytocin and autism. And Solomon and his colleagues said, we know that there is a gene, the CD38 gene. And this gene is responsible for basically telling the pituitary gland how much oxytocin to release. So it's an oxytocin regulator. So they asked, if we take a group of typically developing university students, this is not a group of individuals with autism, but if we take a relatively large group of university students, and we look at how much we see this gene expressed, so this gene is playing a role for these individuals, is there going to be a relationship between the expression of the CD38 gene and autism symptomatology, which basically means if we see this gene, which we can assume means higher levels of oxytocin in the blood, is that going to correlate with something behavioral? Is that going to correlate with individuals having increased or decreased social communication and interaction? And indeed, that's what they found. So they administered a simple questionnaire called the Autism Quotient, which measures autism symptomatology. And they found that people with lower scores on the Autism Quotient, meaning less difficulty with social communication and interaction, were more likely to have the expression of this gene. But that wasn't enough for them. And so we want to know how much this actually correlates with real life. Okay, so we see this gene, and they fill out this questionnaire, but a little bit more practically, how much does this actually impact their social functioning on a day-to-day basis? So they found that the more this gene was expressed, in the individuals where this gene was expressed, there was a greater likelihood of them reporting a higher number of friends and having higher scores on a friendship questionnaire. And so there are takeaways from this study as hormones in the blood are a basis for certain behaviors. There's also an open question of whether or not administering oxytocin, basically giving oxytocin to individuals with autism, is a possible avenue for intervention. There have been a number of studies published on this. I'd say findings have been mixed, but the latest publications that have come out have been encouraging. Oxytocin, oddly enough, is something that you can buy on Amazon for like $25. I don't suggest that you do that, but it's there. But this certainly is an exciting current focus of study, and we look forward to seeing Solomon's study in this field develop. Anat Perry is slightly different, actually, than the other faculty members that I'm presenting, because Anat right now is not at Hebrew University. She finished her PhD at Hebrew U. She's right now completing her postdoctoral fellowship at Berkeley in California. But we were fortunate enough to recruit her back, and she will be joining the faculty next year. Anat's research is complicated, it is fascinating, and it represents exactly the type of work that we are very proud takes place. So Anat takes a three-pronged perspective. Anat looks at social phenomena in terms of the interaction between social, cognitive, and neural mechanisms. So what basically that means is that she wants to know not just what people are doing, but what cognitive processes accompany those actions, and also on the neural level, what neural mechanisms accompany those actions, those interactions as well. And she asks three main questions. First, what are the behavioral and brain mechanisms that are related to social psychological phenomena? Second, what overlap or division exists between social and non-social cognitive processes involved? And if we are able to answer the first two of these questions, will that possibly help us both to understand and also work to support individuals with deficits in this area, in social cognition? And it's important for me to say that her work focuses not only on autism, but also on individuals with social anxiety and psychopathy and others. I want to give one example of a really cool study that Anat did. So she looked at interpersonal distance preference in people with autism. So basically, if you allow me to choose how far or close I stand from the person I'm talking to, what is that distance going to be? Her findings are really interesting. So first, she found that among individuals with autism, there's a greater variance than neurotypical individuals. So what does that mean? You have individuals with autism who might prefer a significantly greater distance between them and their social partners, but you also have individuals with autism who are going to prefer much closer proximity when speaking, which comes back to this idea of heterogeneity, if you know one person. She also found that the interpersonal distance preferences in people with autism was correlated with social anxiety. So, and this makes a lot of sense, the more socially anxious an individual was, the greater their preferred distance would be. And it also correlated with brain signals picked up by ERP, so EEG signals that correlated with preferred farther distance from their social partners. The third finding, which is worth highlighting here, is that sensory sensitivity levels were associated with the preferences here also. Now, for decades, I want to say, individuals with autism, their families, and people working in this field knew that sensory functioning was a very large piece and often represented a very significant challenge for individuals with autism. Only as of May 2013 has that officially been enshrined in the DSM, but now it is finally there. What Anat's findings indicate is that as individuals with autism are more sensitive to sensory input, they will prefer greater distances between themselves and their social partners. We can take that and fairly easily extrapolate that to something that's clinically meaningful. We know that PTs also, but largely occupational therapists, work with children and individuals with autism on sensory functioning, specifically on understanding their sensory profile and allowing them to themselves so that they can feel more comfortable and be able to function and benefit more from their environment. What this finding is basically saying is that the more we are able to assist, the more we are able to provide individuals with autism with coping mechanisms and the ability to regulate themselves, things like Jesse showed us, right? Even something as simple as Play-Doh, right? we are impacting not only their sense of their body and their sensory functioning, but also very directly their ability to engage in social interactions in a way that will benefit them. And so I think that's a really important finding. When Anat arrives at Hebrew U in the fall, she is going to be continuing this really fascinating line of work and looking at the relationship between sensory and social domains, not only in terms of interpersonal difference, in terms of space between social partners, but in terms of all other sorts of things also. So body language, emotional speech, eye gaze, etc. The last faculty member that I have the honor to talk to you about today is a woman who, in some circles, actually really needs no introduction. Nurit Yirmiyah is an internationally renowned autism scholar. She was formerly the chief scientist in the Israel Ministry of Science, Technology, and Space. She was also one of the first researchers years ago to be involved in the study of what we call baby sibs, or the younger siblings of children diagnosed with autism. And I want to talk to you actually not about her research, which still focuses on very young children, but I want to talk to you about an idea of hers, an idea that she presented here, actually just south of here, at the United Nations a few weeks ago in honor of World Autism Awareness Day. Before I do that, I want to present, I think, the model that this idea comes from. So there are different ways that we can think about psychopathology, or the idea of a diagnosis, right? So if we have a bell curve of what is typical and what is not typical, right? At some point on that bell curve, we always draw a line, and an individual very close to that line on one side, we will classify as normal or typical, and another individual right next to that first one, but on the other side of the line, we say, oh, well, this is something that we need to diagnose. This is a psychopathology. And so there are different theoretical models for thinking about how we come up with this line and what this line means. And one of the models is the ecological impairment model of developmental psychopathology. And what this model basically says is that the challenge is not in the individual, but the challenge is in the context, or the relationship between that individual and their environment. So I get around on my feet. The individual in this picture gets around in a wheelchair. Neither one of those is inherently superior until we arrive at a flight of stairs. And once we arrive at that flight of stairs, then that individual has a disability, and I do not have a disability. This is in line with an idea that was actually spoken beautifully about at the United Nations event by Simon Baron-Cohen, another esteemed autism scholar from England. The idea that autism really is a human rights issue. The same way individuals who use wheelchairs must be given ramps to ascend any incline in their environment. And we have an obligation as a society to create a world in which their disability is minimized. The same way, we have that obligation to make those accommodations and provide necessary supports for individuals with autism, to create a society and to create a world that provides them with equal opportunities, educational, vocational, and otherwise. And so Nurit at the United Nations spoke about an idea that she's been developing. There's a paper on this that is available free online, but if anyone can't find it, you can let me know. I'd be happy to email it to you. An idea that she and her colleagues call cool abilities. This idea of focusing on enhanced abilities in what we would otherwise think of as disabling conditions. She says when we look at the broad population of individuals with autism, there are objectively challenges. Some of these challenges include reduced self-awareness, having a hard time dealing with sensory input, as we already spoke about, resistance to change, repetitive behavior, executive functioning challenges. But there are also what she calls cool abilities, enhanced abilities that are not always, but sometimes found in this group of individuals. And that might include enhanced attention to detail, the ability to focus very intensively in a specific area of interest and become an expert in that area, an original thinker, increased visual spatial skills, which we heard about in the context of the Army program, exceptional talent in specific areas, and success at repetitive tasks. We as society have fields and whole professions that are based upon people with that specific profile. And so if you think about computer programmers, different types of engineers, mechanics, machine assembly, lab technicians, video game design, accounting, etc., these are professions that benefit from exactly those cool abilities or those abilities that Nurit and her colleagues are talking about. And it is, of course, our responsibility as a society to make that bridge and find ways both for those employers to find those individuals who can contribute to their workplace, but also find ways to get those individuals with these abilities into these places of employment. So a number of things that we've already heard about today, right? We heard about specialistern, and I actually wasn't familiar with the dandelion story, but it's fantastic. And so there's your dandelion. We know that there are companies like Specialistern that are succeeding based on this model, that employ only individuals with autism. We know that there are Army units that are succeeding not despite, but because of individuals with a diagnosis of autism. It is our hope that we, and the center will certainly do its best to do its part, but in Israel and the US, and as an international community, continue to take steps forward in this process and progress in this area to become a more inclusive society, recognizing strengths, also supporting needs. And I will comment that we spoke less about adults with autism here who are low functioning, right? Adults with autism who are nonverbal. And these systems that we're talking about are not appropriate for that population. That doesn't make that population less important. So we'll have to find another time to get together to talk about those individuals. But that we should move forward as a society to recognize strengths, support needs, always looking to fill the gaps and answer the questions that are as yet unanswered. Thank you. Yeah. I think we have time for some questions. Yeah.
So your last slide, cool abilities and
Yes, there are microphones on both sides of the room.
Okay, so there are microphones A, B, C.
in your last slide, you had cool abilities and employment. Where do we draw the line between those basic assumptions and maybe employment opportunities versus if you know one, you know one? I mean, are we saying autism is expressed with these characteristics and yet everybody's an individual, so why do they all have those characteristics? I've employed autistic people in my office, validates the expression, but sometimes I wonder, am I selecting them because of false expectations about what they're bringing to the table?
So I think my response would be, and Cory, feel free to jump in with anything, but I think my response would be that as a society, we need to recognize what's on that slide. And in terms of policy and practice, we need to recognize what's on that slide. But once it comes down to the micro picture of any specific employer and any specific individual, we have a responsibility not to say, oh, this individual has autism, therefore they will have all of these characteristics, but we need to make sure that it's a good match and that the characteristics that are needed for this individual to succeed in this specific task, in this specific workplace, are there. Cory, do you want to add anything?
I guess.
No.
I have to turn it on or it won't work. There you go. I guess that what I think that you're pointing to is the fact that there is a difference between goals and what we'd like to see and the reality in which we find it ourselves. And I would actually say that it's sometimes not helpful to talk on the group level. And I think that what cool abilities and other issues that were brought up are really looking for a societal change in terms of our philosophy of what we need to do. But I would go back and I would say that with careful assessment and with understanding what we can do with the principles of interaction, intervention, with mutual accommodation, with what the expectations are, with the outcomes, and recognize that we do need to measure these things, I think we would have a higher success rate at keeping people on. I think that a lot of people are not able to keep jobs. And I think a lot of people need the help that we can give them. And that does go back to the idea of support and having someone there as an advocate for those people who can't self-advocate. And there are many of them. And we need to find the balance, which basically says there are rights, and it is our responsibility to make that accessible so that people can do it. And I don't, I rarely speak about, oh, well, these are the abilities, so you should have that because you need that ability. But if you look at the micro or at the individual level, then you have to think about what you can do. So I'm just reinforcing the fact that the question is a good one, and the expectations that we have and the outcomes that we get will, in essence, be the result of how well we can make the individual package work.
So thank you for the talk. A lot of exciting, interesting stuff you pointed out. My question is, we're always concentrating on the high functioning, on their attention to detail, their different many skills. My question is, how do we get the businesses involved? Because I feel like I've been in this field for about 10 years. In the past, I would say 5 years, I've seen businesses open up primarily that have employees of special needs. And I've seen maybe 1 or 2 corporate businesses that actually employ special needs. And I've noticed that agencies like yourself and others here are more concentrated about teaching the young adults on how to get a job instead of teaching those businesses, saying, hey, we have these valuable skills, would you like to employ them?
Okay, that's a really good question for the panel this afternoon. And I think that we can really do that if I'm understanding correctly. And I do think that that's really important. I am going to add a personal comment only because I think that it's an important comment for me to make. And that is that you need one thing to work. And then you would be surprised at how well things can snowball. One of the things that I spoke very much with Michael Beanstalk about is the fact that his data was actually a little bit outdated because the programs that I spoke about for the Army were things that are just snowballing now because we started with one program. And once I got involved in that, and then the Army took ownership of it, and that went on. And again, I think that the program that was expressed here is a really good example, and it's in one place in Australia, and it's time for us to realize that we can do that too. But start with one. Once something happens, then I think that we can go onwards.
Just in 10 seconds, I think that's also a policy issue. And I believe, although I don't know the system here so well, I believe that there are specific programs where corporations receive benefits, tax breaks, funding for employing individuals with disabilities. So I think it's something that needs to come kind of from that level of policy making as well.
I would also add to that you just have to be really careful because autism is different than some of the other disabilities, and it's really hard to understand it, so it's just hard to do it. We've got some questions on this side. Yeah. Here's a microphone.
My question is two-pronged, and it's more specific to the Orthodox community, and particularly...
I don't know if the microphone's on.
You might have to turn it on.
It is
Only
okay,
work.
it's all right. I'll try to be louder. Okay.
Okay.
I'll try to stay on my toes. Okay. Bottom line, I'm going to address myself to the older, higher functioning Asperger's line, and particularly in the Orthodox community. Through personal and professional experience, I happen to know a number of young men, and actually 1 or 2 young women who are above 35. Who are holding jobs on some level, some are better than others, but for whom socially marriage is a big issue. And in the second part of that, I want to relate to something you said about the young man who wanted to be a bus driver, who came from this large family. I assume it was a Haredi family or a Hasidic family, and they were very opposed to anybody knowing about this. So one thing that concerns me is the ongoing stigma. How do you deal with this? And the second thing is the majority of the people about whom you spoke in your programs were to, I think the upper level was 38. And there are people on the upper end of spectrum who still are very high functioning, brilliant in many ways, unique thinking, but still need more social integration and acceptance within the Orthodox community and want to get married and have normal lives.
Yeah. So is your question about specific programs or just the fact that it's not on the radar enough?
Well, one, that it's not on the radar,
Yeah.
and two, in Israel, are they doing more about this age group? The older ones who have already gone through the testing, gone through whatever programs, are integrated to some extent economically, but are on the social margins because they can't find their place within the Orthodox community as the guys and girls who are getting married in their 20s and, launching at that point.
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. And the stigma.
The stigma is something that we all have to work about, and that happens and connects to the question that we had earlier as well. And I don't have an answer to the stigma except that we all have to work about it. I would say two things, and one is that in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel at this point, there are more services than there have ever been before, including for that population. And although it's small, and it's pretty much just in Jerusalem and in Bnei Brak, there are programs specifically for those individuals over the age of 35 who are not married, who live outside of their home. It's when they stay at home that it's such a continual issue for some of the families. So I would say it's not on the radar. It needs to be. Until we get rid of some of the stigma, it's going to continue to be a problem. But I also think that we are in a constant state of flux with developing services at younger ages and carrying them through, while there are people that exist that also deserve some kind of servicing. I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for that, but I do. Forget it.
There are three more.
I don't have an answer for that, but I will say very clearly that it's something that we can't forget. And thank you for putting it on our radar.
So can I just clarify? I was not talking about young individuals who are in the Haredi community. I'm talking about people who are secularly educated, who are Orthodox, who live in the secular world, most of whom live away from their home. And still it's incredibly difficult to get a shidduch. And still it's incredibly difficult to feel socially integrated when everybody around them started the process at a much younger age. That's really big. Okay.
Yep. I'm not sure that there's a good, encouraging response. I think that your point is taken, it's valid, and there's a lot of work to be done. I did want to mention just one thing about the stigma. The pictures that were on the last slide, the special Eastern, the student group at Hebrew U for students on the spectrum, the Army unit, and what's not there, maybe because it's more child-oriented, although I guess most adults begin as children, right, is most. Is Julia, right? This new Sesame Street Muppet. And that's not insignificant, right? And that is obviously representative of a larger movement in our society. But the fact that I'm able to sit at home and show my 4-year-old daughter this girl it was an incredibly emotional moment for me. It means that kids who are sitting and watching TV on Saturday, Sunday morning, whatever, exactly, Jesse has Exhibit A. Those are things that we may not see the fruits of that right now, but those are things that there will be a generational shift. And I very much hope that we will see stigma reduced.
Wonderful. I'm actually going to add one comment if I can, and that is that if you are looking for a model to do something like this, there is a model of a group that is happening in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem. can connect you to the people who are doing it. It's run through an organization, through the Joint in Jerusalem called Ashalim, and they have a dating service for people on all of the levels of functioning with autism. And they have them, they interview them, their professionals interview them, they give them some skill level, and they actually also organize evenings where people come, and they also do some supporting of things once people get together. I don't know enough about it to say anything other than I know that there have been some matches that have come of it. It is based on systems of people without autism for whom that is also a problem in communities in which people want to be married, and when you get to a certain age, it doesn't work. But it is a program that has been adapted for the kinds of needs and support that our people need. So that would be something to connect for, to get some more information, and I can give you names and emails of the people who are running that program. A great program, by the way. I want wins.
A couple of things I wanted to. Is this
One
better?
more.
Yeah, it's not quite.
These microphones are horrible.
Yeah.
I'm a special ed attorney who's on the spectrum myself, and a few points. Number one, I think in this country, what you're talking about with life skills, we always advocate as parent attorneys for life skills. Schools don't focus on that. It's all about, I find this over and over with school districts, the kids getting A's and B's, that's all that matters. The social, emotional well-being, the life skills, none of that matters. All that matters to them are the grades, the pure academics. You know, the kid can get A's and B's in math and writing and all that stuff and not know how to tie his shoes or not know how to make dinner or not know how to do basic skills of daily living, and they don't focus on that. Or they don't focus on the kid that could, now it's working, the kid that could be getting A's and B's and is depressed, isolated, suicidal. None of that is focused on. So one thing I think would be great as well is I'm on the board of COPA, which is the National Parent Special Ed Attorney and Advocate Organization, would be a way to do some, have people like yourselves from Israel and other countries that are expanding these models and have them come and do more international best practice sharing. I'm sure Israel's not the only country. Being Jewish, I'm biased, but you know, I think a lot of countries, other than maybe North Korea, would be great to see what they're doing on autism. Sorry. But in all seriousness, I think we need to do more of that, not just national, but international best practice sharing. And I think that the problem is what you're talking about in Israel, they don't look at that here. Two other points I wanted to make, as you were talking about the self-advocacy, and I'm sorry I missed Jesse's speech. One thing I think that's a problem with the whole, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism is, and it's not her fault, many people think all autistics are Temple Grandin. She's not, it's not her fault, but she's become the template. And unfortunately, she's become this stigma to everyone else. And most autistics, 90% I've met, are more warm and emotional than she is. So I think that that's part of where the problem came from, is that everybody is expected to be Temple Grandin. And it's a false model. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about, you were talking about the autistic Muppet, I actually heard a complaint about it, that I thought was interesting, which is they had the Muppet on The View with Elmo, and they said whoever scripted it wrong because Elmo did all the talking and let her do nothing, and basically spoke for her, which did not promote self-advocacy or the ability to be independent. And everyone's sick of Elmo to begin with, but the point is they said that by letting Elmo dominate and speak for her, it did not promote... It reinforced to kids that autistic kids can't speak for themselves. So those were just my points, and I think... Wants to say something.
Should I go to the mic? It's not, now it's on. I want to say I contacted Sesame Street with the idea of bringing them up. I guess it was Albert Newton before it was Julia, and I bragged that they stole my idea, which is probably a bunch of nonsense. That's not true. They were already developing the Muppet, but I told them that they should stop with walking those eggshells and worrying about pleasing the whole world, because they just can't. There's always going to be hate mail, and if they went in the other direction and had a self-advocate, then more parents would complain and say, you're not representative of my child who has low communication skills. It's sort of like online dating. You cannot win or make everybody happy. But one thing I want to say about what you just spoke about is that one of the positive stigmas for getting businesses involved is letting them know that it's about enhancing their bottom line. It's not about whether it's charity or you feel sorry for someone with autism, but people with autism have a much lower turnover rate. They're less likely to turn over in jobs and just job hop when something does not work out. They need that for their social structure, the job, and they'll stick around longer, and less resources have to be spent retraining people.
Thank you very much.